begin first with 3 introductory remarks that I hope will make my remarks clearer. The first is about history. My perspective on interreligious relations is informed by my perception of the history of relations between religious communities. This is probably the most important factor guiding my theology of religious relationship. It will become clearer as we move along. The second is about the formation of new religions. I will speak a fair amount about this because religious formation has a huge impact on the perceptions that religions have toward one another. New religions begin as movements before they become religions, and they exhibit patterns of relationship with the religions out of which they form. The third is terminology. The word Israel is the traditional Jewish term for the Jewish people. In my remarks today, Israel refers not to a modern nation state, but to a people, a worldwide religious community that is also a population. The closest parallel being the Arabic term ummah, which has the exact Hebrew cognate term ummah, peoplehood. Also, sometimes when referring to the Israelite God in the Hebrew Bible, I'm going to use the spelling of the name Yud-He Vav-He. So, during the days before monotheism, the world was inhabited by many powers and many gods. We know a fair amount about this period from ancient writings and archaeology. This was an age of universal polytheism. The life of most communities was organized around their gods. Different peoples shared the same cosmic deities, such as the sun, the moon, the sea, and so forth. They referred to them by different names, and they engaged in different worship practices, each particular to its own population, but these deities were shared between peoples, tribes, and nations. In addition to the cosmic deities, each community had its own particular god, a tribal or national god. Chemosh was the god of the Moabites, Milcom the god of Ammonites, Marduk the god of Babylon, Ptah of Memphis in Egypt, Dagon of Philistia, and so forth and so forth. The tribal gods were not shared. They cared for their communities by protecting them. Their communities, in turn, cared for their gods by feeding them through offerings and sacrifices. Early biblical religion did not look much different from this. The Hebrew Bible has abundant textual evidence of pre-monotheism. Perhaps the most famous is in Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, when Moses and the Israelites sang out, "Who is like you among the gods, Yod-He Vav-He? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders?" The God of Israel here was one God among many. It was Israel's God alone. And of course, probably like all communities, Israel felt that its God was better than other community gods. My dad is bigger and stronger than yours. Israelite pre-monotheism was one of many versions of practice in a pluralistic religious world. Israel interacted regularly with other communities. Each was distinguished by language, culture, and community deity. Although each community had its own God, all practiced the same core religion and shared a common theology. Different communities learned from one another. They borrowed ideas and contributed practices and traditions. Their gods were, among other things, totems that supported and reflected the uniqueness of their communities. They were, probably like the God of Israel, jealous gods. God is even called El Kana, the God of jealousy. That was because the gods were dependent on the offerings of the communities that served them. When communities engaged in battle, their gods battled as well. These tribal gods were not all powerful. The God of Israel fought for Israel and sometimes with Israel against Israel's enemies. All the biblical scholars here will already know about a fascinating biblical case study of a historical war between Israel and its neighbor Moab in 2 Kings chapter 3. This is a rare case where there's a corroboration of a biblical event in a non-biblical document, a stone plinth known as the Mesha stone, named after Mesha, the king of Moab. According to the biblical version of the episode, the God of Israel was victorious. But according to the Mesha stone, it was Chemosh, the god of Moab, who defeated Israel and its God. In this pluralistic pre-monotheist environment, people could make offerings to the gods of other peoples. We know this happened because the Bible condemns the practice repeatedly. Israelite worship, their sacred places, and even their temples looked and functioned very much like those of neighboring communities. And then things changed. For some reason, no one knows why, one community of ancient Near Eastern peoples made a transition to monotheism. It was a difficult journey. It took many generations for Israel to complete the passage. The Hebrew Bible is full of stories about Israel's failure to remain loyal to the one great God. Yet eventually they arrived at the conclusion that the entire universe was created by a single deity who was the only true God. This is what the Egyptologist Jan Assmann calls the Mosaic distinction. The transition to monotheism led to drawing a distinction between true and false in religion. If there is only one true God, then all the other claims are false. Biblical tradition ascribes this to Moses, hence Assmann's term, the Mosaic distinction. The Israelites learned that one God created the world and everything within it. Of course, from their perspective, it was natural to believe that that one God was the God with whom they were most familiar, their God, the God of Israel. After the transition to monotheism, Israel became a spiritually lonely community. No other population in its world had a similar notion of God. Israel could not tolerate dialogue with the religious other because there was no language for it, no room for theological conversation. This was the situation during much of the biblical period. Discussion with people of other religions was impossible because there was nothing to discuss. In the pluralistic environment of pre-monotheism, everyone practiced one or another version of the same religion. They shared nearly everything aside from their community gods. This doesn't mean that everyone got along and loved one another. They competed with one another for resources, markets, labor power, all the things that communities fought over. And they fought, but they did not fight about religion. And then, after one community's transition to monotheism, their singular God stood apart from a world of multiple transcendent powers. The God of Israel demanded that God's people, the only people that understood true religion, lived where they would not be tempted to interact religiously with people practicing false religion. The threat of backsliding into polytheism was constant. The entire world practiced religion one way, Israel practiced another way. The land of Israel served as a safe haven for the people of Israel. It was a sanctuary, an asylum, where they could worship their holy other transcendent deity without temptation to revert to the more direct worship of deities that could be touched and seen. The God of Israel was all-powerful, but it was not simply a God of power. Free from dependency on offerings for sustenance, this God required only spiritual allegiance and ethical behavior, no feeding. It rewarded the people when they were worthy, and it punished them when they failed to live up to the divine imperative. This explains why the Israelites, whose God was the all-powerful God of the universe, could seemingly be vanquished by peoples energized by false gods without real power. Consider the Assyrians and the Babylonians when they conquered Israel. Contrary to their own claims in 2 Kings, it was not their gods that overpowered Israel. On the contrary, it was the God of Israel punishing the people of Israel with the armies of Assyria and Babylonia for failing to live up to God's ritual or ethical requirements. For centuries, the small Israelite community won and lost wars, but remained essentially an independent and largely confident entity. They lived in their safe haven under the patronage of their universal, all-powerful God. But after many centuries, they were utterly defeated by pagan Roman power. From the traditional Jewish perspective, it was, of course, Israel's sins that caused the end of its sovereignty, not the Romans. The Romans were a tool used by God to mete out punishment to God's people. During the period of Israelite decline under Roman power in the last 2 centuries before the Common Era, Israelite religion lost its center and began splintering. There were, of course, always factions competing for influence and power in Israel, as in every human community. The Hebrew Bible contains many stories about rebellions between tribal and clan factions and individuals over influence and the authority of the priesthood, the kingship, and even prophethood. But the divisions seem to have reached a high point during the Roman period. Some of the factions described by the sources were, as many of us know, scribes, Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, Zealots, Sicarii, Herodians, elders, various priestly families, and probably others. Israelite sovereignty finally ended with internal mayhem and eventual collapse. The end began with the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE and was finished with the overwhelming catastrophe of the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 136-139. The destabilizing influence of Roman civilization in Judea before the destruction created an environment for massive change. It enabled the emergence of new syntheses of biblical religion and Greco-Roman ideas. This would produce movements that eventuated in what we know today as Christianity and Judaism. Without monotheism, there can be no formation of new religions. Another way of saying it is that before monotheism, there were no religions. There were gods and peoples and nature, human powers and natural powers, all interacting with one another under a common basic worldview that, if you want to call it religion, was one religion. Christianity was the first new religious movement. Why? Because it claimed, in opposition to the view and practice of the established religion, to represent the true understanding of the one great God's design. This is why the Mosaic distinction is so vital. The emergence of a new expression of monotheism suddenly made it possible for religions to argue and compete with one another over which represented the true intention of the one God. Christianity was the first new religious movement, and as such, became a threat to the established religion in Judea. Christianity claimed the mantle of monotheism that had been held by Israel until Christian emergence. Christianity claimed that it represented the fulfillment of the biblical promise. Therefore, there was no longer a need for the monotheism that preceded it. Christians are the new Israel. The old Israel, of course, did not appreciate that perspective. So, because the religious establishment, that is Israel, had power, it tried to discredit the new movement. The new movement was attacked as a syncretism that claimed to be monotheist, but was not truly monotheist. Think again of the Mosaic distinction. In parallel to the formation of Christianity, we find the formation of Judaism. Judaism must be distinguished from the practice of Israelite religion in the Hebrew Bible. It's not the same as biblical religion. Different worship practice, different religious customs, different theology, different legal tradition. Christianity was a new religious movement and was attacked by the established Israelite religion as false, but Judaism was not. Why not? Because while Christianity defined itself as a new articulation of the divine will, Judaism defined itself exactly as not a new articulation of the divine will. The believers in Christianity claimed to have received a new revelation. The believers in Judaism did not. The messaging that Jews claimed for authority was not a new revelation. On the contrary, Jews claimed that what they believed and practiced was the religion of the ancient Judean kingdoms, originating with the divine revelation at Mount Sinai. In other words, the rabbis claimed that Judaism was biblical religion. They considered the revelation at Mount Sinai to be a twofold revelation, consisting of a written Torah and an oral Torah. The written Torah was written on the scrolls of the law, but it was accompanied by an oral tradition transmitted from God to Moses, who passed it on to Joshua, who passed it on to the elders of Israel, who passed it on to the prophets, who passed it on to the men of the great assembly, until it was finally written down in the Talmud. As the establishment monotheism, biblical religion could not countenance any claims for a new vision of monotheism, a new revelation, a new canon of Scripture. We already have these things, they said. Why would God suddenly offer a new one? And there's even a statement in the book of Numbers. Lo ish el veichazev uven adam veitnecham. God is not a human being that should lie, or a mortal that would change their mind. Therefore, Christian claims are false. Israel had power when Christianity was emerging as a new movement, and Israel responded to the threat of a new religious movement exactly as people in power threatened by new religious movements do today, through argument, through ridicule, oppression, and worse. But Judaism was not threatening to Israel in the same way as Christianity because it claimed not to be new, even though it was new. These changes, the emergence of both Judaism and Christianity, occurred during the turmoil of the end of Israelite sovereignty and the collapse of the Jewish Commonwealth. One was nearly destroyed by the power of the Roman state. That was biblical religion merging into Judaism. The other was eventually adopted by that same power, the Roman state, as the official and then the only sanctioned religion of empire. That was Christianity. The collapse of the Jewish Commonwealth was rationalized by Jews as divine punishment for the behavioral sins of Israel. Virtually the identical narrative was articulated by Christians. The collapse of the Jewish Commonwealth was punishment to Israel, but Christians were convinced that it was for the sin of refusing to recognize Jesus as Messiah. The sudden reversal of Christianity from a despised religion to the religion of empire was rationalized as well. I coined an expression that I think encapsulates its significance. History proves theology. Christianity had been a sect persecuted severely by the Roman state. Christians were thrown to the lions and the spectacles of the arena. Then, within 2 generations, it became a tolerated religion, and then the religion of the empire. I can easily understand how Christians might believe that proved the truth of Christianity. The Jewish response to this period of trauma and transition was to retreat and retrench in a bid to survive without the protection of political sovereignty. Jews closed themselves off even more from the world and tried to avoid situations of conflict, especially with Christians, who were the most threatening and who were now also on the attack. So let me just take a moment to a quick aside. Why did Christians continue to attack Jews even after their complete degradation after the destruction of Jewish life in the Holy Land? Some Christians certainly took revenge for Israel's earlier mean attacks against them. But once Christianity was without doubt the greatest religious power, and Jews were reduced to powerlessness and penury, why did Christians continue to do so? There were certainly several factors depending on the time, the place, and the persons doing the writing. But one reason was, in my view, the continued, one could even say, eternal threat of Jews and Judaism to Christianity. What was the threat of a powerless people? It was that Jews continued to resist the truth of Jesus' stature, even after it had been proven 1,000 times historically, theologically, politically, and militarily, according to Christians. Jewish believers in their ancient expression of monotheism simply refused to accept the new narrative despite what seemed obvious. And the Jews were very old, ancient already at that time. There's a certain awesome gravitas in this, and I suspect that it evoked significant anxiety toward the faith. To my mind, that was infuriating. So to conclude this section, I want to characterize the relationship between the first 2 expressions of monotheism as what we call in English a zero-sum relationship. That's a Null-Summen-Beziehung, yeah? This is Assmann's mosaic distinction. One is true, all else is false. If one is right, the other is necessarily wrong. So how does Islam fit in? Well, Islam completely demolished the zero-sum relationship by emerging as a third successful monotheism. Its very existence upset that balance. Drei sind einer zu viel. 3 is a crowd, we say in English. But that's because the third party upsets the stasis between 2. Islam upset the apple cart. I have an idiom for this too. I don't know if this is going to work. Let's try it. Sand ins Getriebe streuen. Is that right? So Islam upset the apple cart in other ways as well. First of all, it does not claim to replace Judaism or Christianity, as Christianity claimed in relation to Judaism. Why not? Because Islam was born into a world of many monotheisms, not only Christianity and Judaism, but several competing forms of Christianity and Judaism as well. The Quran does not claim to replace Judaism and Christianity or even to fulfill Judaism and Christianity. It claims rather to be better than Judaism and Christianity. This is a revolutionary claim, and it does terrible things to the Mosaic distinction. It does not suggest that there is only one truth and all else false. It suggests that one religious notion can be closer to the truth than others. This opens up the relationship between the monotheistic traditions to innovative ways of thinking about the religious other. The Quran, like the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible before it, contains many layers of meaning. And like the scriptures before it, sometimes it stresses the universal and sometimes the particular. Sometimes it feels indignant and sometimes delighted. But however you read the Quran, it is clearly more open to pluralism in monotheism than either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. For example, and I will probably butcher this because I'm anxious in front of real Arabic speakers, Inna alladhina amanu walladhina hadu wa nasara wa sabi'in man amana billahi wal yawm al-akhir wa amila salihan falahum ajrahun 'inda rabbihim wa la khawfun 'alayhim wa la hum yahzanun. Indeed, those who believe among the Jews, the Christians, and the Sabaeans, whoever believes in God in the last day and acts righteously, they shall have their reward with their Lord, and they will have no fear, nor will they grieve. The Quran offers many more verses with similar intent, and certainly more, according to my counting, than the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. One other aspect of the emergence of Islam is important to mention here, and that is that it deflated the Christian argument, history proves theology. I believe that one of the reasons for the strong antipathy Christians have always had toward Islam is that its success exploded that myth, the myth that history proves theology. But then, not surprisingly, the notion that history proves theology became a common perspective among triumphant Muslims, just as it had among triumphant Christians earlier. And I would add that many Muslims have been angry at the modern West from the 19th century onward because the success of the West and the relative failure of the Muslim world, at least to keep up, was a fatal shock to Muslim versions of that same mythic idiom, history proves theology. And not surprisingly, many triumphalist secular Westerners believe today that their military and economic success is another expression of history proves theology, or some secular version of that mythic assumption, and that's why they get so ballistic when they can't remain in control. But among Muslims, the notion of history proves theology took hold after its conquest. History proves theology is not found in the Quran. Neither is it found in the New Testament. I'm not completely sure about the Hebrew Bible, but that's a question we could discuss later. It's generally agreed that Jews fared better in the Muslim world than in the Christian world in the Middle Ages. There are several likely reasons for this, but one is the willingness of Islam to view Christians and Jews as respected monotheists, even if mistaken in their refusal to accept Muhammad as a prophet of God and the Quran as divinely revealed scripture. Nevertheless, for Jews, the Middle Ages was a difficult period. There was much intellectual and artistic productivity, but Jews were always under pressure in both the Christian and Muslim worlds to disavow their tradition and take on the religion of the ruling power. Simply to withstand the conversionary pressure, Jews had little good to say about the religions that they felt oppressed them. There was also an effort to discredit the ruling religions because conversion to them, frankly, was always a ticket to a level of status and respect that one could never have as a Jew. So during the Middle Ages, Jewish writings about Christianity and Islam and Christians and Muslims were decidedly negative. Only a few exceptions can be cited here, such as Menachem HaMeiri, 17th century Provençal Talmudist. Yeah, and I was thinking of him when we were talking about Nicholas of Cusa as well. There were exceptions here and there, right? Modern thinking relativized the absolutist nature of monotheism in many respects. The result was a certain softening along the edges, but it also brought about a hardening at the core, both among Jews and Christians, less among Muslims, who did not experience modernity directly and organically as did Christians and Jews in Europe, but rather somewhat more distantly on the outside. With modernity, which was in Western and parts of Central Europe, not in the East, Jews began to be considered fellow travelers in the secular nation state. Many Jews adapted by redefining their identity as a religion rather than an ummah, as in the period of Israelite sovereignty and the Middle Ages. These were the reformers, but others retrenched and would have nothing to do with the temptations of modernity, forming what is today generally called Orthodox Judaism. But just as modernity seemed to be working for some Jews on the edge in the West, though not in Eastern Europe, the entire project became discredited and humiliated by Nazism and totalitarian communism. For Christians, that dual crisis and the extraordinary shock that it engendered enabled a certain window for a reevaluation of prior assumptions about monotheism and the Mosaic distinction. It took a couple of generations, but it eventually produced Nostra Aetate and several other important reevaluations among both Catholic and Protestant Christians. That new openness, in turn, split the Jewish community. It was met with cautious optimism among the liberal movements, with profound skepticism among the Orthodox. The two positions are well articulated through the writings of Rabbis Joshua Heschel and Joseph Soloveitchik. Things remain fluid in the Jewish community today. The specter of the Holocaust and the danger faced by the State of Israel have a profound influence on Jewish theologies of relationship. So, what do I learn from this historical journey? I learned that we are all victims of history and our deficient perceptions of the same. We invent false solutions to existential problems for which solutions have not and probably will never be found. So many of us, in our collective frenzy to prove we're on the right side of the Mosaic distinction, make false assumptions about God, about history, and about the role of the religious other. It's better, to my mind, to remain modest and admit that we do not really know much about anything of the truly transcendent, beyond perhaps intuition. I've learned so much from my Muslim and Christian colleagues that I cannot consider their way of understanding to be necessarily false, even if in some ways it doesn't make sense to me. I would like to close with a thought from a short essay called "The Night I Died" by Tracy Cochran. What we really have to share is not any spiritual treasure we imagine we have stored up, but our poverty, our common human situation, our inability to know. Thank you.